Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bridget Polachine at the IIB, and I want to thank you all for joining us for our COVID-19 webinar series presented in partnership with our valued associate professional members. Today's session is the second of the series, and we're very pleased to have our partners from KPMG here to help us explore operational resilience in cybersecurity, information security, and IT resiliency. Continuing critical customer services, applications, data, and technology infrastructure while minimizing the risks of fraud, data leakage, data protection, and cybersecurity issues created by third parties. These are the challenges IIB members are facing, and today's webinar will explore how firms are and should be responding and what regulators will expect in the near and longer term. Guiding us through the discussion today are Charlie Giacco and his KPMG colleagues, Matt Miller and Franco Cordiero. Charlie is a principal in the New York office of KPMG and is the U.S. Information Protection and Cybersecurity Financial Services Industry Lead. He's focused extensively in multiple disciplines on information security, including designing and implementing a wide variety of technology-based security solutions. We're really lucky to have such expertise available to us today, so thank you. As a reminder, all participants are muted, but we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, or if you aren't using the Zoom app, you can email them to us during the webinar at info@iib.org. So again, through the Q&A feature on Zoom, or email them to info@iib.org. As per our now usual practice, following today's webinar, we'll email all of you the slides and a link to the recorded session, which will be available to you on our YouTube channel in the members only section of the website and Zoom on demand. So thank you all for your time with us today. Charlie, I'll virtually hand the mic over to you.
Thanks, Bridget, and thanks for IIB for hosting us today. We appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. This is Charlie Giacco. I lead up our cybersecurity business, both nationally and globally for financial services. And as Bridget mentioned, I'm joined with two of my colleagues. Matt Miller recently joined us about 6 months ago and spent some time prior to that at an investment bank, first in the, CISO's organization and then in the second line of defense. So certainly has an interesting perspective on how all this is affecting us now. And Franco is one of our subject matter experts in operational resilience and business continuity recovery. So it's great to have this discussion today. I'd say I'll kick it off with a high level on what I'm seeing at from a financial services perspective. And for me, cybersecurity, information protection, information security, whatever you want to call it, is very, very closely tied to operational resilience and what the regulators are really thinking about from a cyber risk and cyber resilience perspective. Prior to all of COVID going on, there was an absolute push by both the Fed and the OCC on this concept of cyber resilience. And they were really pushing on the largest banks to figure out what that really meant, what would happen if there was some type of widespread cyber outage, and how does that affect the overall operational risk of the firm. And the concept of cyber risk and cyber resilience, for that matter, being part of operational risk is also a newer concept. Going back maybe 4 or 5 years ago, you had the idea of an IT risk management group or a technology risk group floating somewhere between the chief information security officer role and the idea of somewhere in the chief risk officer's role. And it wasn't, in my view, very effective. It was mostly a policy setting organization and didn't have really a whole lot of clout on pushing those policies and making sure they were enforced properly. About 2 years ago, the regulators, members of the FDIC, the OCC, and the Fed started really pushing this idea of splitting up cyber risk into a separate organization and really having that baked into the overall operational risk organization, or ORMA, or whatever your group calls it, within the CRO's organization. And that really started changing the game for how people thought about operational resilience in general. Then enter things around what the FS-ISAC was pushing with Sheltered Harbor, which was really the cyber doomsday event of consumer markets. If there was a widespread crash of a bank on the consumer side and all of the data centers went down, how do you get your customers back online, right? So there's been a collaborative effort within the industry to work on things like that. So the idea of cyber risk and operational resilience certainly isn't new, but it's newish. And once COVID happened, it really got pushed very, very, aggressively into the forefront. As you can imagine, everyone's starting to work from home, trying to figure out how to get access to, the workplace environment, making sure that's safe and secure. And by the way, we have to make sure that, from a business continuity management, all of our systems administrators have access to all the things they need to keep the infrastructure up and running. If we're not on public cloud, which most aren't, another large topic of conversation for a different webinar. But that's what we're seeing at a high level, and really COVID has pushed this up to the forefront. So what I think we'll do here is we'll have Matt talk a little bit about what the effects of COVID are from an overall cybersecurity and information security perspective, and then we'll spend some time really making sure we're all on the same page of what operational resilience really means and how that ties to cyber risk, and then we'll bring that all back home to COVID and what that means for us today.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Hi, Matt Miller. I'm a principal in our cyber practice focusing on the banking sector. What I want to bring to you today is really a framework that we're using to describe COVID and how we expect our clients to be able to, not only react, but to manage through this situation. So our framework has 3 phases. The first phase is resilience, followed by a recovery phase. And then what we're all looking for is really the new reality. Once we clear all of the COVID distraction, what does the new world look like? And in doing so, we wanted to provide a few examples of what we've seen. First is resilience. So this is a phase that really we're probably through. And it's one that I think, at least in the banking sector, we actually felt like we responded very well. So many of the banks were able to really move to an extended work from home environment with really minimal impact to their overall operations, but they had to make some significant changes, and they had to make those changes in really a pretty immediate and unplanned way. So really 2 themes in resilience I'd like to talk about that we can see how that will really change us once we move to recovery and new reality. The first is getting to that extended work from home environment. A lot of organizations had the infrastructure to have part of their staff work from home, but there were significant concerns that their VPNs, that their remote access wouldn't be able to sustain what they needed to keep their workforce employed. They also didn't truly understand what the potential impacts could be on critical infrastructure. So could the telco providers, your internet providers sustain an environment where everyone's working from home, where kids are working from home, and they're doing that for a real long period of time? What some organizations also did is they also, in order to facilitate their workforce, made a lot of kind of rapid risk decisions. So we saw organizations do things like allow people to bring their desktops to their homes so they have computing at their home environment. We saw organizations choose to allow collaboration tools that weren't previously approved in their environment so that people can interact through video so that they can share and collaborate in a way as close as possible to as they would in the office. And so some of those risk decisions, were made and now have added to the aggregate risk of the environment. The other thing that organizations haven't fully understood yet is kind of the idea of working in a hostile home network. So, firms like ours that are consulting, we're used to doing this. We're working in coffee shops, hotels, on different client sites all around the world on a regular basis, and our infrastructure is set up for that. But what happens when you move, your company is not used to have a traveling workforce. You have people sitting at home where they may have BYOD devices. They may be like me, where I have 3 kids that could be downloading malware and could be infecting my network at home. And that risk truly isn't fully good or managed at this point in time. The other area where we saw a fairly significant, potential risk that we were able to navigate through was in the supply chain. So if you had third parties, especially those that may be outsourced to foreign countries, there could be different impacts than we saw here even in the US. They may not have the ability to work from home. There may be things that you are using clean rooms for, and now all of a sudden you do not have the physical security controls that you use to protect your data. And so those were areas that our clients navigated through in that really first phase of resilience. Now, where are we today? Today, we're starting to see organizations really strongly look at recovery. So how do they get out of that initial panic reaction mode, and how do they understand what are new risks that they have in their current environment from changes that were made? What are risks that they need to be able to manage given the changes in the threats? So we've seen increase in fraud, we've seen increase in business email compromises, we've seen increases in ransomware. And so there's different ways that the organization needs to react. They're also starting to wonder if they're going to have financial pressure. So do they need to look at how they can optimize costs? Do they need to look at how they can potentially restructure their security program? And can that really be an advantage for them? The other thing that could be very interesting, even in banking, is you may start to see some sort of merger and acquisition activity similar to what we saw during the financial crisis. So how could you potentially be acquired or acquire other institutions or other customers and take advantage? And what does that look like? And then looking toward the new reality, one thing that is we're very optimistic about is a lot of organizations are starting to really embrace things like moving to the cloud. They're looking at doing that from an operational resilience standpoint, but also ability to be able to manage your infrastructure in a more distributed manner. And so we're seeing that as being a very interesting differentiator that a lot of our customers want to embrace. The other thing that we've seen is really a look at some of the convergence of fraud and cybersecurity and how to truly use machine learning and AI, one, to be able to stay up with the pace of what we're seeing with new threats enter the environment, two, to be able to respond in an economical manner that's very predictive, to be able to manage risk in an area where threats have been increasing. And so with that, I want to use some of these themes to really hand it back to Franco to talk about how can cyber and how can both business continuity and cyber resilience come together to be able to make a long-term sustainable strategy for our clients.
Thank you, Matt. So the voice you're hearing belongs to Franco Cordero. I am the co-lead of KPMG's Business and Technology Resilience team here in the United States. As you can tell by the accent, I come out of Australia, where I led KPMG's Business and Technology Resilience team there for a number of years after transitioning from an investment bank where I was the head of resilience there. So this is a subject kind of near and dear to my heart, and in particular, I think one of the best declarative pieces of information we have on the topic of operational resilience as a starting point is probably still the Bank of England discussion paper. I know Charlie mentioned a couple of other regulatory guidance pieces, in particular from the FSISAC, from the OCC, the FFIEC also, in their recent exams for some of our clients, has been sort of touching on the subject of how individual discrete components of things like cyber resilience and IT resilience are tying into the overall concept of operational resilience. And so we're seeing their thinking progress towards concepts of market-wide resilience, where individual organisations are asking to take their individual disciplines that are contributing to resilience within the organisation and marry that up so they can create, systemic stability in the interests of minimising counterparty and consumer harm. And so I still think, in my opinion, personally, the Bank of England discussion paper that was put out in mid-2017 is probably the deepest piece of thinking. There are individual regulators like the MAS that are taking elements of this and then defining tolerances around operational resilience in terms of, responses to incidents that might impact the financial system as a whole. But I think as a holistic thought piece, that paper in and of itself is probably the best paper that exists at the moment. You've received a polling question. And so interestingly enough, I think it'd be good to perhaps rate your response against a similar question that we asked in mid-2017 to respondents who were involved in a similar webinar on the topic of operational resilience, where we found that 60% of respondents at that time have rated their capability in the area as developing or below average. Interestingly enough, on another forum to a slightly smaller group, I ran a similar question, and in the 2 years that had elapsed between originally asking the question and the release of the paper by the Bank of England, and as recently as 6 months ago, the dial hadn't really been lifted all that far. Still, over half of the respondents rated their capabilities as developing or below average. So I think it's still fair to say that while there are capability enhancements in things like cyber resilience and IT resilience, overall, in terms of bringing together a connective tissue into a holistic operational resilience program, there's still some way to go in the industry, and that's evidenced by some organisations that we've been helping recently to clear matters requiring attention in this specific area. Charlie, I don't know if you have anything to add in terms of your client insights. I know that recently, our experience has been that, there are still MRAs existing in this area, both from an individual component basis. So, for example, improving cyber resilience, improving BCP, but also still from a holistic perspective where the regulators are not seeing these disciplines joined up into a cohesive whole. So I'd be interested to get your insights as well as to what you're saying.
Thanks, Franco. It's a good question. I mean, from my perspective, there are still, like to your point, a large number of MRAs out there. Some of them are more targeted to really standing up and creating that second line, that cyber risk organization, and having that flow up somewhere in the chief risk officer's organization and having it actually mean something. How are you challenging the CISO's organization effectively, or technology risk in the first line more broadly, and how are you, reporting on that up to the board and out to the internal audit and out to the regulators? I'd say the idea of operational resiliency being part of that is frankly a lot newer. Typically, what comes out of the Bank of England will flow its way a year-ish later. So if you think about that, around mid-2018, early 2019 is really when we started seeing this stuff pick up in the US, and then less than a year after that, COVID, right? So it really has come to the forefront very quickly. I'd say cyber resilience is still a bit of an enigma on what it really means to each organization, and how does that fly to the overall operational resilience. But the idea of operational resilience not just being BCP-DR anymore. It needs to mean much more than that, as proven by this whole pandemic. I'd say that's my perspective. I don't know, Matt, if you have anything else to add to that.
No, I think you're right. I mean, when I was working for the bank, this came out of Bank of England, there was also a lot of back and forth in terms of, what do different definitions mean? What are some of the concepts and the requirement? and what will the regulators specifically be looking for, because they thought they were giving specific requirements at the time, but we weren't able to interpret them in that way. Some examples were really around, how do you manage third and fourth party risk? What are your requirements, and really looking at your critical infrastructure, looking at sustainable risks across the sector in general. So I think that organizations are starting to come up with their own approaches and kind of own strategies for this, but there, it hasn't converged to, you can put operational resilience in a box and implement it within an organization. It's something that is going to be transformative, but we still have to transform to get there.
Thanks, Matt. I think both your views and Charlie's are a good segue into the piece of work that we did to assist our clients, and also just contribute to the general thought around the Bank of England paper. It is a longish paper. It can get quite detailed, and particularly when you include some of the really informed commentary that came with it. I think our first task was then, I guess, to take that concept, as Charlie was saying, from an overall perspective, and then strain it out into its key components. And so, as a consequence of doing some primary research, going through the paper in quite some detail, and speaking to a number of our clients, we've essentially distilled it down into 7 key components. And then, I guess our ask was to try to tie it into some of the business continuity, IT disaster recovery, overall risk management disciplines of the organisation, to make sure that it makes sense both to cyber practitioners as it does to core IT and enterprise IT practitioners, as it does to business resilience and crisis management practitioners. And so I think these key components are now well established. They're reasonably well understood. And I think, if I were to just run through them very, very quickly, really the concepts of operational resilience being board down is really not that great a departure from existing resilience or business continuity and IT disaster recovery disciplines, particularly from a cyber perspective as well. I think recently we have seen a significant pull from our clients and also the industry in general to upgrade and enhance board reporting. So we run a number of exercises and run a number of education sessions for boards and oversight committees, specifically on the topic of cyber, and enhancing both the questions that executives are answering to get insights, and also the quality and the candor of the reporting that's being provided to them. It's less about compliance now and more about assurance-based reporting. So I think in this case, the cyber teams in organisations have been providing their boards and oversight committees with better reporting. I think the interesting thing now is it's tying it into a consistent whole across some of the resilience disciplines and organisations that will contribute to the satisfaction of operational resilience as a concept. End-to-end, this is again a concept that has been reasonably well worn. It's in fact good sense to make sure that you're thinking about resilience, in particular cyber resilience, from a customer perspective. This is probably one of the areas that I think our cyber colleagues have been leading the overall resilience market, and that is in that we take a particularly strong focus on compromises to the organisation that might have a consequent impact to our customers and to the market. And so really a lot of our cyber disciplines have been tooled to assuring our customer data and customer information. But this is an area where business impact assessments are tying into cyber risk assessment to form a cohesive whole. So I think mostly we're not seeing any regulatory gaps or even operational gaps in this area, because cyber has led the way in terms of its end-to-end thinking. I mentioned the question of measurement, and that ties in very closely with board reporting. The better your measurement, the better your ability to be able to fix and improve your state of cyber resilience. In particular, we run recurrent exercises for our clients in terms of cyber resilience maturity assessments that are focused specifically on measuring over time the state of cyber resilience and the improvement over a defined life cycle. That typically tends to get boiled up into some board reporting and some dashboarding to help improve the state of cyber. A resilience culture, this is often a difficult area. Again, it's one of the ones I think that cyber is leading in terms of periodic training, organisations constructively testing their own staff and their ability to disseminate and decipher and understand and identify phishing emails is a good example. This is an area where I think there is a significant degree of cyber alignment to operational resilience. And then a recovery-centric mindset is always something that the cyber practitioners have been pioneering in concert with BCP and IT disaster recovery colleagues. It's, I think, central to any cyber program to have a defined identification, escalation, and then reporting and triage process that will tie hand in hand with safe forensic capabilities of organisations. That leads to testing. This is in particular probably one area where I think we do see consequential gaps between, I guess, the regulatory standard and the operational standards being set and the testing that's being performed in industry. A lot of the pull recently from our leading organisations is saying, look, we don't want to stare into some of the issues that we had, as Matt was mentioning, transitioning from a resilience into a recovery mindset in terms of being able to tool out our technology and execute our recovery strategies. And so we need to test more deeply. We need to test for edge risks that are further out on the likelihood curve. And so I think this in particular is an area where if you're thinking about grappling with the concepts of operational resilience and how you can contribute through cyber and IT resilience, would be an area to ask yourself and reflect. I think testing is a big area where we see probably the greatest degree of maturity required. And then finally, communication goes hand in hand with all of these other disciplines. It's something that organisations generally struggle with. It is a recurrent issue that we see when we're asked to do post-incident reviews or post-mortems or after-action reporting. But it is an area where we're seeing significant improvement. Communications teams, HR teams are working more hand in glove with cyber and BCP and IT resilience colleagues to produce more holistic communications and reporting. Charlie, Matt, I don't know if you have any particular insights or thoughts from your individual clients on these areas and in terms of maturity areas where they need to improve?
Yeah, as I look through this and think through your talk track there, Franco, I think the measuring part of it and actually reporting it to the board is really the key piece that's missing. And like we said earlier, it's less about, BCP and DR testing now, right? How do you think about the overall cyber resiliency for the firm? And how do you tying this back to more operational risk type concepts such as risk appetite, and tying that back to testing against potential threat scenarios and how they affect the risk appetite and what your key thresholds are? How do you report on that? And I think that's the key thing that's been missing. And I don't know of, frankly, any organization, including some of the largest top 5 banks on the planet, that have really figured that out well. So I can imagine it's an issue across the industry. I mean, Matt, from your experience, just having done some of this, how are you guys thinking about measuring some of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so I think in our culture, it was easy to drive some of these concepts into, both operations as well as into kind of oversight and getting senior leadership to really appreciate the risk here. I do think that, even before COVID, a lot of where you got interest and traction was still fairly reactive. It was in doing either, hopefully you didn't have an incident, within your organization, but maybe doing a could it happen here analysis of an incident that happened at one of your competitors or even in another industry, or a near miss that could happen in your organization that you wanted to learn from. I do think that, when you started to look at testing and looking at kind of tail risk scenarios, it was hard to always get people to really be convinced that something could occur. There was all this optimism that, this would never happen. We appreciate why we're testing it, but maybe not fully appreciating the reason for that type of testing. Obviously, with COVID, no one would have thought there would be some people thought, but not many people were fully prepared for a global pandemic to happen in this kind of manner, where you could be, in a recovery scenario for quite a while. And so hopefully coming out of COVID, people will realize that some of these tail scenarios are plausible, and there's a lot that can be learned and integrated all the way through, from how you do communications to how you build your culture to how you make sure that the board is driving strategy and comfortable with the investments that the firm is making to be operationally resilient.
Thanks, Matt. I guess in keeping with that, I just wanted to talk about the concept of enabling assets and capabilities. It's, I guess, one of the key questions that we see oversight committees and regulators are currently asking. And it points to their questions around, what are we doing that's new? Because I think as the maturity around the assessment of operational resilience starts to grow, the question then gets asked in terms of, okay, so what are we doing new at the base level to tie disciplines together? So as Matt was saying, we need to manage edge risks and systemic risks more consistently. How are we doing that today that's different to yesterday? And what are the capabilities that we're drawing together to do that? Because if we're just seeing this as a rehash of our business continuity plans with slightly greater weight and their names being changed to operational resilience plans, there's going to be an attendant degree of suspicion for that, to whether or not the true principles of operating on a holistic basis are actually being achieved and being driven towards. And so some of the leading organisations we've seen are starting to pull together broader maps from across the organisation and considering their enabling assets on a broader basis than just the classic sort of resilience pillars that were, BCP, a crisis plan, and IT disaster recovery plan. And so we've just called out like a number of the more traditional ones here. Frameworks I've mentioned, business continuity plans, risk and control, insurance frameworks. But there are, and I think I was commenting to Charlie and to Matt earlier, there are literally, I could fill of slides like this with enabling assets and capabilities that can be measured and that can be leveraged into a cohesive operational resilience whole. And here are just some of them. I know the slides will be sent out after this presentation, and so it'd be good for you to maybe have a look through if you're questioning what the operations are that we need to pull together into a cohesive whole. Here are some of the ones that are being espoused by regulators and some of our leading industry clients in terms of things like, their organisational structures to assess HR's capability to delegate authority and to have staff being able to delegate authority and work remotely in teams that are still empowered to take key decisions and that can confront, reasonable amounts of churn, staff loss, and also absenteeism due to health impacts. And so it's a much broader scope, still through the prism of people, process, and technology, but there are certainly a greater number of contributing capabilities and assets that are being drawn together into the more cohesive whole. I guess now I just wanted to have a quick word about some of the things that we are seeing that we like from leading industry players. And I guess this is focused more from the financial services industry and also the tech industry supporting financial services. So we managed to have the privilege of talking to some reasonably large and sophisticated tech companies that are kind of grappling with how their business service model has changed at the same time that their clients have changed. They're having to support clients that are working from a work from home or a remote environment while they themselves are working remotely. So it's a bit of a concatenated challenge. But I guess basically from the organisations that have shown themselves to be adept at being able to manage the challenges associated with COVID and large disruptions, they tended to be the organisations that thought initially, and before the Bank of England paper came out and there were regulatory drivers, they thought more holistically about resilience as a concept and as a construct. And they used things like as-a-service operating models. So their ability to, Charlie mentioned earlier, leverage cloud-based as-a-service consumption as a way of buying into greater resilience than they themselves could provide. I think one of the interesting surveys that we put out was that most organisations would move to cloud. More of the sophisticated organisations, I should say, that were thinking about resilience holistically, were moving to cloud not just from a cost basis, which was, I guess, one of the biggest drivers for the for the industry as a whole, but they were thinking about it more from the perspective of how can we improve security and resilience at the same time. And those organisations that were thinking about that in concert with cost savings typically we're able to extract resilience dividends as a basis of, leveraging third parties' ability to build on their individual resilience capabilities. And so I think those organizations, as a takeaway, that thought about resilience holistically, both inside and out and all the way through to third parties, were commensurately better at moving to a COVID environment, and also supporting organizations that themselves were customers and who are operating in COVID environments. Another thing we spoke about here and that Charlie mentioned earlier was the establishment of clear tolerances and measures. At KPMG, we firmly believe that you can improve better what you can measure. And so I think the organizations that have pulled us in to think about how they measure their state of resilience and then tie it into an overall risk tolerance typically tended to do better, not just in terms of understanding where their compliance gaps might be. So if you think back to that slide where we had those individual 7 components of resilience, they were able to understand how they were tracking and how they were maturing in terms of objective attainment across those capabilities. But the more sophisticated organizations were then able to take it a step further and say, given we have a defined pool of investment to improve our resilience, where should we be investing that money for the greatest return? And so we've helped some financial services organizations recently improve their framework and develop a resilience investment prioritization framework so that you can actually measure for every dollar or unit of resilience investment that is applied to gaps across your key capabilities, where you are extracting the greatest benefit as a function of how that lessens or meets your overall risk appetite. And so those organizations that have been able to do that have actually reduced their numbers of MRAs in the operational resilience / board reporting area. And so that's something that you may want to take pause and ask yourself about the sophistication of your reporting and whether or not either from a siloed perspective or from an overall perspective, you're still measuring sheer compliance, existence of plans, existence of resilience, cyber resilience plans and testing, or whether or not you're taking an assurance mindset in this area, because we think it's one of the clear delineators between organizations that are more successful in adopting operational resilience than those that aren't. Charlie, I don't know if you have any insights or anything you've seen in terms of how organizations are measuring resilience and then boiling it up into an overall view, and whether or not you're seeing organizations that are achieving this successfully.
Yeah, I'll let Matt opine, as he's done this fairly recently in his second line role. But I think from my perspective, it really comes down to your point that the tolerances and thresholds, and besides testing, how are you actually measuring against those risk tolerances and the thresholds, and to your point, reporting to the board. I think that sounds simplistic, but I think even getting agreement on risk appetite from a cybersecurity or resilience perspective is not an easy thing to do. I mean, when you ask someone what their risk appetite is for, disaster recovery, for example, in a pandemic like this, it's probably close to 0, but that's not really rational or reasonable. So how do you effectively get the board and the risk committee to approve the appropriate risk appetite that has an appropriate measurable tolerance, and then go back to measuring it and testing it and measuring it effectively? Matt, thoughts on your side?
Yeah, so I think I've seen some very bad ways to do things. So like you said, if you set your risk appetite to 0 for anything, in effect, what you're communicating out as the board is infinite investment to address that risk. And I think that is not what the board is always saying when they have kind of a 0 risk appetite. And so I think getting to meaningful risk appetite statements along with the supporting measures and metrics is key to having a successful program. I also don't think you always end up with one, risk appetite. So you may have a risk appetite, at the board level, that as you move down through the organization, it's actually going to expand the aperture. And that's so that you can manage those risks appropriately. You don't want to always hit that cliff of a risk appetite where it requires board notification, at the same exact time. What you want is a hill that you're rolling down, that you're approaching your risk appetite thresholds, so that you can manage to it appropriately, or you can see how fast that rock is rolling to be able to know when you're going to hit it, where you do need to notify the board, where you may need to notify even your regulators. And so having something that allows you to open up the aperture early, to be able to get good data, and to be able to report in a predicted manner versus in a very reactionary manner. I also think data quality is key. So, what you don't want to do is have a risk appetite event where you're saying the sky is falling, you're crying wolf. And once they dig into the data, you realize that the assets you were looking at were misclassified, or some of the reporting systems that you had coding errors in them that kind of drove you to reach the risk appetite thresholds. And so making sure that it's tested, that it's really measured, that it's agreed upon by all parties is key. And I also think you need a reset function. So if you keep breaching your risk appetite, that may not be a bad thing while you're defining it, in order to be able to understand what it needs to be. Because if you run into a situation where you're actually lowering your thresholds or raising your thresholds to the extent where they're never ever breached, then they probably have really no value. And so I think that those are things that organizations really need to consider as they build a strong governance program for measuring their risk tolerance.
I think one thing you said there was important, and that's creating the appropriate risk appetite based on the risk tolerance of your firm. So many times I see organizations look at cybersecurity from a regulatory perspective as a compliance must do. What are the minimal things I need to do to make the regulators or internal audit go away? And that's just absolutely the wrong way of thinking about it. The reality is, if you're meeting the very unsophisticated requirements from the regulators, and that's your minimum threshold or your maximum threshold for how you want to invest, you're probably in a situation like this not doing very well. So really having that appropriate risk appetite that's measurable based on your firm's risk is super paramount, and I am sure much more risk adverse than what the regulators are looking for.
Tyler, I think that's spot on, and I guess that ties into one of the other, key. We've put together three key lessons that we're seeing and insights, and the last of those is learning from challenges and empowering teams. I think the point that resonates to me greatly that you and Matt just went through was that if you set your risk tolerance to 0, which we have seen, boards quickly ask the question in terms of then why are we seeing severity 4 and severity 5 cyber resilience incidents. I'll leave this polling question up here just in case it's being presented to the webinar group as a whole, just so you can see the responses for a minute. And then basically the inverse to that, as Charlie pointed out, was that you set your risk appetite or your tolerance too leniently, and then you're not actually learning from any incidents that are occurring, and you're giving yourself a false positive sense of resilience capabilities. And so what we're seeing is that organizations are actually calling us in and saying to us as to almost, which is diametrically opposed to the narrative that we were sort of speaking with them previously about, which was, look, let's do a constructive test to, I guess, find some reasonable gaps in our capabilities, but we kind of really want to control testing and steer it to a known outcome. And so we kind of characterize that more around us helping organizations to enhance their ability to run a test. Whereas I think now we're seeing organizations really stare into, here is our risk appetite. How can we really construct cyber resilience and IT resilience exercises that are going to actually challenge the fabric of our ability to recover? We don't want to test our ability to run a test. In fact, we want to run some of these in a constructive, sandboxed environment that pays deference to risk management principles. But we basically want to test stuff and until it breaks. We want to kind of find what our tolerance time periods are for some of our recovery capabilities are. We really want to work out whether or not providers that we have on standby can come in and help us launch a forensic investigation, for example. So there are some key areas now, and we had a client recently say to us, look, we want to stare into, COVID has taught us that we want to stare into the zombie apocalypse type scenarios, then dial it back a couple of notches, but really take our teams into some deep water because, retrospectively, we feel like our testing has been kind of tested to the basis where we know we're going to pass. Whereas we kind of want to feel like we're doing testing where we actually, constructively erode the performance of things and break things so that we can learn how to reconstruct them really quickly. In addition to that, what we're seeing, to Matt's earlier point, is that the organisations are bringing in their third parties and actually testing together to break stuff and asking the what if questions continually until they get to a point where they know that they have gaps, so they can constructively measure those against their risk appetites and then report that up to the board. You'll be surprised how many organisations had significant issues transitioning into this COVID environment, especially when they then experienced other issues to do with either, staff attrition or to do with IT incidents, and were basically incapable of responding according to how they had planned and tested for sometimes a number of years. And so I think that's a particular area that we're seeing now where organisations are willing to constructively push that risk appetite on the basis that, it's a test. We're challenging our teams. We're empowering them to fail and learn on the basis that when we have to stand up these processes in real life, we'll respond that much better. Again, just to be helpful, we've pulled together some practical actions that we think will be beneficial for practitioners out there in the field. They're really just good business practices and they're kind of no regrets. And so I don't intend to run through all of these, but I think what we are seeing some organisations do is call us in to give them a quick evaluation of some of their management practices against agreed target states, just almost on a pilot perspective, so almost like an operational resilience minimum viable product. One of the classic issues we've seen in this area, and it was an area with BCP, was organisations' abilities to effectively get across their entire organisations from an end-to-end perspective. They were bedeviled with interdependencies, multiple process dependencies, processes that concatenated each other depending on the view of the organisation, inconsistent process taxonomies, a whole glad bag of issues that got in the way of cyber resilience and business impact assessments being performed adequately. And so what we're seeing organisations do now is taking a more nimble approach. Agree one particular business service that has an end-to-end customer outcome and very, very defined parameters on that, tight time frames in the order of 2 to 6 weeks, and saying, let's run a minimum viable product here to see how this will tie into an overall operational resilience view. And we're seeing organisations then learning from that process and then banking dividends as they extend that discipline out across the organisation. One of the other things that we're seeing organisations do is revisit their board awareness programs to make sure that they are, particularly in this COVID environment, taking advantage of, board involvement in crisis response processes that maybe boards and executive committees and oversight committees weren't traditionally getting themselves involved in, and leveraging that contact to say, look, let's do some training exercises and then let's tie how you visualise your response in the context of what you're seeing from a board perspective with how it actually works operationally and whether or not that actually fits into your conception of the risk appetite that we've set, and then attenuating risk appetites as a consequence of that. Getting in front of the board and having those discussions is never a bad thing in our view, and it always comes up with learnings no matter how many times it's been done. So I'll leave this polling up for a second, and I'm heartened to see that, that one of the no regrets actions here that is probably leading here is to begin bringing key stakeholders together, getting some support and some groundswell behind then running a minimum viable product, which I think is probably the smartest way of going about implementing operational resilience. If you try to do it holus bolus in one shot, it's a fraud activity because there are many complexities that you have to deal with at a given point in time. And so with that, and with that tour of operational resilience, I'll hand over to Matt, who's going to summarize for us, aligning the topics that we've discussed into an overall cybersecurity view that kind of aligns to what we think will be the new reality post-COVID.
Great, thanks, Franco. I'll cover this slide fairly quickly, and then we'll try to see if there are any questions out there. If we go back to the original phases that we spoke to in terms of where we were seeing, cybersecurity risk tied to resilience recovery in the new reality, we wanted to talk a lot about some of the evolution that we're going to see of the environment. So obviously within the resilience phase, it was all about how do we stand up urgent reviews? How do we make sure that we get our crisis teams to get the right tooling out to our individuals and get our workforce up and running in the environment? I think as we move kind of from resilience to recovery, we've seen an increase in having to do incident response at people's houses, which is something that I think people weren't fully, expecting. And everything from, a cybersecurity incident to a business continuity incident where, someone spills orange juice on their laptop and all of a sudden, they're out for a week because the supply chain is really hard to get new equipment out to people. I think as we move into recovery, we're starting to see organizations look at their security controls, look at opportunities for a reduction in cost and the spend, to be able to look at some of the processes that may have been old and expensive and burdensome, to look at how they can actually apply new technologies, new methods to be able to create efficiencies and optimize their cybersecurity organization. And then as we move into the new reality, we truly see an evolution here. We do see an adoption of, continued adoption of machine learning and AI, especially as it applies to the convergence of cyber and fraud. We see cyber getting closer to the front office and further from the back office, and really getting along with the customer experience. So if you're going to go to your bank, you want to have great experiences with your customers in terms of authenticating them. There's new technology you can use when they call the call center, where they can be authenticated by their voice, and you can slow down the wait times that they have and allow things to be more self-service. So that cyber evolution is going to require trusted computing environments. It's going to require cyber to really, lead in certain areas to ensure that you maintain your customer confidence. With that, Charlie, any final comments before we take questions?
Yeah, I'd say, just thinking about this evolution here, cloud was almost a four-letter word, to financial services in general about 18 months ago, but 2 years ago. And I think if your organization wasn't thinking about it, and how to handle it from a risk perspective, they're thinking about it now. So you'll see a pretty aggressive push to the public cloud. I think there's still some regulatory hurdles to get through to make it really meaningful, but that'll be part of the overall, risk reduction to the firm, where the infrastructure isn't necessarily your problem anymore. And also just, will eventually, be a cost lever. I think this idea of digital trust is going to be huge going forward. As you can imagine, there's a lot of fraud going on right now. Traders are working from home. They're not having necessarily their phones monitored all the time. That's one thing to think about. Obviously, from an insurance claim perspective, things are spiking in just general call center. If you can imagine the volume with all the PPP, loans that are coming out right now, and the volume everyone's taking, very rampant fraud going on right now. How do you get ahead of that and look for that? And it's going to require some innovation in the machine learning space. So I think those are the three biggest areas. And then lastly, we very briefly touched on it, but third-party risk. Everyone right now is got, critical third parties as part of, what you do for your firm. Most organizations are requiring that their highest risk vendors require an on-site visit to go make sure that everything's looking great. Well, guess what? No one's going on site right now. So how are you managing that risk? I think you're going to see some significant innovation in the way we think about third-party risk and where all your data is going, and how you evaluate the riskiness of those third parties in your firm. So those are the biggest areas I see. I think they're exciting challenges to solve for and needed. And I think this will be this pandemic is basically a push into the things that we're already starting to, but we'll really, really push them into the foresight. So yeah, I mean, that's where we're at. I know some questions have come in, so I guess Megan or Bridget, I didn't know if you wanted to leave some time here for those.
Sure. This is Bridget. I know one of the questions, and you just started to touch on it in your summary here in terms of, you know, regulators and some perhaps hiccups or challenges in fully moving to the public cloud. And then you also just mentioned third party, and I know that, you know, third party risk management is something that regulators have been focused on. Just wondering, well, just a third piece too, all the regulators have had to move to a you know, out of office environment, virtual environment as well. So I'm sure, you know, they're experiencing some of these challenges. I'm just wondering, either, you know, based on your work with clients or prior experiences, what do you think regulators and supervisors in the you know, banking world at least will be focusing on in terms of kind of best practices, lessons learned, expectations going forward, you know, kind of starting now?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take those, I guess, back to front, because I think the best practices will frankly drive the regulators. From my perspective, they tend to see what some of the largest organizations are doing from a best practice perspective, and start, you know, thinking around tying a regulation they can push out to the rest of the industry in that manner. MRAs tend to get people doing things similarly, that's for sure.
Right.
So, you know, for me, you know, and I've seen the push to the cloud pretty aggressively and very quickly here. Right now, it's been an issue around data protection and encryption strategies, and making sure that there's an appropriate way to monitor and protect the data, as well as how do you grant someone access to it once it's in the cloud. It's much different when things are in a public cloud than they are on your infrastructure. And then, you know, more importantly, which is something all the regulators have been focused on for well over a decade, is access controls. How do you prove who's got access to what? And that's obviously much different when you're thinking about public cloud. I think some of the largest organizations have started to solve that, and there are certainly some unique vendors that are applying their technology on top of the public cloud vendors to help with those scenarios. And companies like KPMG are building technology to help facilitate all the connection points on-prem. So that'll start to evolve very quickly. I think the third-party space is just going to get more and more aggressive. The idea of flinging out a questionnaire and having someone answer it and bring it back, those were already starting to become onerous, and people wanted to get rid of that process, but there was nothing else out there, and it was a really good compliance checkbox. But we already talked about how bad compliance checkboxes are, and that really doesn't help with your inherent residual risk. So that will change pretty quickly as well, from my view. I don't know, Matt or Franco, if you had any other thoughts on best practice.
Yeah. I mean, I think what organizations should really expect is the regulators are going to look at how people responded during this and what decisions they made. And so, you know, if you are making decisions to lax in certain controls, if you know, are choosing to even change some of your you know, financial crimes reporting thresholds to be able to deal with the volume, they're going to want to know that you're making those decisions with the right you know, risk management, governance, and transparency in place. And so I think now's a critical time to, you know, look at all of your, you know, second line functions that typically, you know, support your regulatory response, to make sure that you have that appropriate governance, that you have that appropriate the risk decisions documented.
Great. We got another question just popped in. I know we have like 30 seconds, but the question is asking for your observations regarding, you know, cross organization, sort of where does typically, or what are the options for responsibility for management of cyber the cyber resilience. And then second, tabletop exercises, how have those or how will those change?
Yeah, I'll start, and realizing we're at the top of the hour, it's a really good question and probably something that would require a few minutes here, but it really depends on how you're regulated. Most that are regulated by the OCC and the Fed would have started putting this, these types of programs in the second line within operational risk or somewhere under the risk committee or the chief risk officer, really overseeing how the first line does it. As far as how tabletops changed, I think these will just be newer scenarios to add to it. Maybe these were more far-fetched going forward in the past, but I think these are very valid, and you'll start seeing much more advanced threat scenarios that would be done at the board level via tabletop exercises such as this. But I think we're still reacting to this one, so we'll see how it evolves in the next 6 months post everyone's starting to get to the new reality. Great.
Well, Charlie, Matt, Franco, thank you so much. A reminder to everyone that the deck and the session will be available. Look for the email or go to our YouTube channel, Zoom, or the website. We want to thank you three again for taking the time to be with us today and leading a discussion of a very important topic. I'm sure we'll be circling back. Thank you again, and everyone stay well and stay safe.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Take care.